Ever since the end of World War II, the Jews have understandably gotten the sympathy of Western nations such as the UN and the US for their plight as a persecuted people with nowhere to call home. Even today, most of the US continues to view Israel as a victim in recent conflicts with Palestinian groups. Israel isn't entirely innocent, though, and to wholeheartedly support Israel would be to ignore the suffering of an oppressed people. The two most important questions, in my opinion, that need answers in order to decide who to support are, first, whose land is it anyway? And closely related is the second, who's the victim in all of this? In order to determine this, we have to look at the history of the land now in dispute between Israel and Palestine. Some sources that I've seen have traced the land all the way back to at least the Old Testament, when it was known as Canaan. Canaan was taken over by Israel and became Judea. Judea was then conquered by Rome. In the 1st century, Rome created a nation called Palestina, which was then conquered in the Crusades in 1099. After that, it became part of Syria, then the Ottoman Empire. When the Ottoman Empire fell, it came under the control of the British. Which brings us to 1917, when we see the Balfour Declaration, which basically announces the intent of creating two nations, Israel and Palestine, with certain limitations on Palestine, such as military, weapons, etc. In 1922, we have the Palestine Mandate, and Great Britain finally gets around to dividing the land. According to certain sources, they ended up giving more land to Palestine than originally discussed in 1917. In 1947, Egypt sweeps in to take Gaza, Jordan sweeps in to take the West Bank, and troops march on Israel, allegedly with the intent of wiping it off the face of the planet. Israel pushes back, however, and manages to retake land and even expand its borders a little bit. The PLO is still a very important voice of the Palestinian people and has, in recent years, gained limited recognition in the UN. Some sources say that the PLO charter declares its intention to destroy the nation of Israel. However, when I went back and read the charter, I found no explicit mention of destroying Israel. Of course, I was reading in English. I don't know if I missed something lost in translation, but I did see in articles 20, 21, and 22 that they do not recognize a Jewish nation. Of course, Israel doesn't recognize a Palestinian nation either, so basically they decide to not recognize each other. The PLO says there will be no compromise with Israel on land, and it does say it wants to destroy the Zionist threat. Does link Israel to the Zionist threat, however. But it's not like Israel is the Zionist threat, but that the Zionist threat is enacted through Israel. At least that's my interpretation of the English version of it. In 1967, the biggest victory for Israel, the 6 Days War, where it establishes itself as a nation and takes a large portion of land. Sometime after the 6 Days War, the lands that were once supposed to be Palestinian come under the control of Israeli military occupation. In 1987, we see Hamas surface. They are the main party now, it seems, in conflict with Israel in the Gaza Strip and in the West Bank. They are formally recognized as a terrorist threat by some Western nations, including the US and the UN. In 2005, Israel withdraws military personnel from Gaza, but then they erect a full blockade. As a result of the blockade, Palestinians living in the Gaza Strip have limited access to humanitarian aid, jobs, and supplies. The unemployment rate is reported to have risen to 40%. And I wanted to compare this with the recession in the US starting in 2008, when unemployment became such a big issue. The unemployment rates go anywhere from a whopping 7.2% to 13.5%. And this is compared to the 40% unemployment in the Gaza Strip. We also start to see complaints of settlers, which are Israeli families who decide to settle just over the Israeli borders in what is controlled by Palestinians, and this way they sort of fudge the borders and slowly expand the borders of Israel. In Israel's defense, there are also reports of the government of Israel kicking them out, but it still is a problem. There are also reports of violence erupting between the settlers and the Palestinian people, which has an eerie similarity to the problems between early colonialists in the now U.S. and the Native Americans. Around this time, we also learn of Israel enacting administrative detention, basically holding somebody indefinitely with no trial and no charges. There are even reports of torture in this administrative detention, which is basically what the U.S. does with Guantanamo Bay, which, by the way, despite 2008 campaign promises, is still open. Because desperate times call for desperate measures, it's not surprising to see Hamas rise to power in the Gaza Strip. In response, Israel, of course, sends a ground invasion of Gaza, some intermittent airstrikes, and another ground invasion in 2009. The recent flare-up of conflict appears to begin with 3 Israeli teens being murdered in June of this year, allegedly by Hamas members from the West Bank. Israel then bombs the Hamas in the Gaza Strip, who, by the way, are not allegedly involved in the 3 teen murders, and they invade West Bank. Just a month later, a Palestinian teen was murdered, allegedly by Israeli extremists. So basically, both sides have extremists killing each other. And each side blames the entire other side for the wrongdoings of certain extremists. And the conflict just continues to escalate, leading to the news stories we've seen over the last couple weeks, including the bombing of schools. So now that we review the timeline, whose land is it anyway? Well, the Christian community I grew up in, and I think most Christian communities in the U.S., would say Israel. They're God's chosen people, and God gave them the land, which we see in Genesis 15, 18 through 19, Joshua 1, 2 through 3, and Exodus 3, 8, where God gives Israel the land of the Canaanites. And we see in Joshua 1, verses 2 through 3, God says, I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse those who curse you, which is what originally made me nervous about not supporting Israel, at least until I rejected Christianity. Of course, don't you think it's just a little bit convenient that a religion that originated from the Israeli people would declare them the chosen people, and their God just says, here's this land, you can have it? I don't think that anybody would be happy if another people swooped in and said, hey, my God that you don't believe in said that I can have this land, so I'm going to take it, and you should be okay with that. No one's going to be okay with that. I wouldn't be okay with it. We wouldn't be okay with that if Mexico or Canada just came in and said, hey, God said we can have this land. How exactly are people supposed to react to that? So my conclusion is that neither group has any particular claim on the land greater than the other. I think the Israeli people do need to have their own homeland. I don't necessarily think that was the best place to put it. The fact that Jerusalem is there causes problems on both sides. I really wish Jerusalem would just cease to exist. I think that might make things a little bit easier. But I don't see that happening anytime in the near future. So if no one really has any undeniable claim on the land, who's the victim in all of this? Well, State of Daniel and most of the Christian community in the U.S. would say Israel, because Israel is just protecting itself. Even if no one has any particular claim over the land as far as who had it first, Israel's there now, and they're just protecting their own land. Well, isn't that what Palestine is doing? aren't they protecting their own land? Because Israel isn't just protecting their land, they're also expanding their borders and oppressing the land of the Palestinian people. That's what gets me. They're not just protecting their land. In fact, 70% of the death toll of the war between Hamas and Israel are Palestinian civilians. Because Hamas has no problem bombing civilians. In fact, they do that on a pretty frequent basis. And Israel targets Hamas specifically, not just Palestinian civilians, but neither do they really get hung up on a civilian death toll. And they have no problem sacrificing civilians in order to get to Hamas, which we see with the schools that they bombed. So, if no one has particular claim on the land, it's the Palestinian civilians who are the victim in all of this. Not saying Hamas, I'm not saying Israel, but the Palestinian civilians who can't get humanitarian aid, who are having problems finding a job. 70% of the death tolls is the Palestinian civilians. How can we possibly think that the victim in all of this would be somebody other than them? The next logical question would be, so if the Palestinian civilians are the victim in all of this, what is a plausible solution between the two factions, Hamas and Israel, that would help end this and end the suffering of the Palestinian people? Well, that is clearly an answer that's hard to come by, as the fighting has continued throughout many tries at peace talks. The only solutions that we can really see going forward would be one side or the other wins and wipes out the other side, or kicks them out of the country or the land, nation, area, region, which isn't really a fair solution. That's not one that I personally would hope for. The second possible solution would be that they decide to be able to get along, and there creates a two-nation compromise, such as that outlined in the 1917 Balfour Declaration. Of course, we don't really see this happening either, seeing as neither side will officially recognize the other as a nation, and neither side will really trust the other to have access to the resources that could eventually help them in a war. Third, another impractical solution, which is nobody gets the land. Both people find somewhere else to go, ideally on opposite sides of the planet from each other. If I were an all-powerful god, that's probably what I would do, just pick them up and move them. But again, not really a practical solution. Neither group's going to just pick up and move, especially not both groups, and especially not with Jerusalem still there. Thank you for watching. You can like, comment, subscribe, rate, all such things down below. Of course, as always, the main sources that I've used in my research are also linked down below. This is Firewalker asking, tell me what you think. Which side is the victim here? Whose land is it? And what would be a plausible solution?